April 11, 1945, 100 miles west of Berlin, Germany. First Lieutenant Merritt Duane Francies, 24 years old, from Wenatchee, Washington, sat in the cramped cockpit of his L-4H Grasshopper, scanning the landscape below for German positions. Behind him, First Lieutenant William Martin served as observer, radio in hand, ready to call artillery strikes on enemy targets. Their aircraft, officially designated Miss Me, was flying at 700 feet above the tree line. It was painted olive drab. It had a 65 horsepower Continental engine. It weighed 1,220 pounds fully loaded. It cruised at 75 miles per hour. The Germans called American P-51 Mustangs the Destroyer. They feared P-47 Thunderbolts dropping bombs. They ran from B-17 bombers overhead. But the aircraft they truly dreaded was the one Francies was flying. The slow, unarmed observation plane that looked like a farmer's crop duster. The Germans had learned that when a Grasshopper appeared overhead, an artillery barrage was minutes away. What happened next would make military history. Francies and Martin were about to become the only Allied aircrew in World War II to shoot down an enemy aircraft using nothing but their service pistols. The last aerial kill of the European war would belong not to a fighter pilot, but to two artillery observers flying what German soldiers mockingly called the fabric toy. The pilots nobody trained Fort Sill, Oklahoma, 1942. The Army faced an immediate problem. It needed hundreds of pilots to fly L-4 Grasshoppers, but it didn't have time for traditional flight training. Regular Army Air Corps flight training took 9 to 12 months. The ground war in Europe wouldn't wait. The solution was radical: recruit pilots who already knew how to fly. The civilian pilot training program, launched in 1938, had trained over 435,000 civilian pilots using Piper Cubs. Between 1938 and 1944, 75% of these pilots trained specifically in J-3 Cubs. Many were flight instructors. Some owned their own aircraft. Others had accumulated hundreds of hours flying for crop dusting companies, local airports, or private businesses. The Army commissioned them directly into field artillery units with minimal additional training. If you could fly a Piper Cub, you could fly an L-4 Grasshopper. They were mechanically identical. Second Lieutenant Bruce Gale typified the program. He learned to fly Piper Cubs as a civilian. The Army recruited him in 1942. He received a commission and was assigned to the 947th Field Artillery Battalion with minimal military flight training. His most extensive training wasn't in flying, it was in artillery procedures. L-4 pilots needed to understand trajectory, range, deflection, and fire direction. They needed to read maps, identify coordinates, and communicate with fire direction centers using proper military terminology. A typical mission briefing focused less on flying skills and more on artillery mathematics. Target bearing 285 degrees, range 8,000 yards. Observer correction, drop 200, right 50. Time of flight, 30 seconds. Pilots learned to calculate where shells would land based on firing data. They learned to recognize shell bursts and determine corrections. They learned FM radio procedures for calling fire missions. The flying part was almost incidental. These men already knew how to fly Cubs. What they needed to learn was how to kill with artillery while flying. The training was brutally short. 4 to 6 weeks of artillery procedures, 2 weeks of tactical flying exercises, then deployment to combat zones. Some pilots arrived in Europe with less than 100 hours total flight time. They were expected to fly low over enemy positions while German soldiers shot at them. Yet the program worked. The combination of civilian flying experience and military artillery training produced pilots who understood both aviation and artillery. They weren't fighter jocks. They weren't bomber crews. They were artillery officers who happened to fly, and they were devastatingly effective. The airplane nobody wanted 1941, Washington, D.C. The U.S. Army Air Corps rejected the Piper J-3 Cub for military service. Their assessment was blunt: technologically obsolete, insufficient speed for combat operations, inadequate range for reconnaissance missions, unsuitable for modern warfare. General Henry Hap Arnold, commanding the Army Air Corps, was building an air force around speed, altitude, and firepower. The P-38 Lightning could reach 414 miles per hour at 25,000 feet. The B-17 Flying Fortress could carry 8,000 pounds of bombs to targets 2,000 miles away. The P-51 Mustang would become the finest fighter aircraft of the war. The Piper Cub didn't fit that vision. It was a civilian trainer. It was built from fabric-covered steel tubing and wooden wing spars. It had a wingspan of 35 feet and weighed less than 700 pounds empty. It topped out at 87 miles per hour. But the Army Ground Forces saw something the Air Corps missed. Field artillery commanders had a problem the Air Corps couldn't solve. They needed to see beyond the range of ground-based observers. Artillery in World War II could fire shells 15 miles, but observers on the ground could see perhaps 3 miles in ideal conditions. That meant 80% of artillery range was firing blind, wasting ammunition, and missing targets. The Air Corps solution was to assign reconnaissance aircraft to photograph enemy positions, develop the film, analyze the images, and deliver reports to artillery batteries. This process took hours. By the time artillery received targeting information, enemy forces had moved. What artillery needed was real-time aerial observation. Eyes in the sky that could watch shells land, and radio corrections instantly. Drop 200 yards, left 100 yards, fire for effect. The Air Corps argued this was impossible. Reconnaissance required fast aircraft that could survive in contested airspace. Slow observation planes would be shot down immediately. But Army Ground Forces officers studying German tactics noticed something interesting. The Wehrmacht used Fieseler Vieh 156 Storch observation aircraft extensively. The Storch was slow, cruising at 80 miles per hour. It was unarmed. It operated at low altitude. Yet German artillery achieved devastating accuracy using Storch spotters. How? The answer was air superiority. Once Allied or Axis forces controlled the airspace over a battlefield, slow observation aircraft could operate with relative safety. Ground fire remained a threat, but enemy fighters couldn't reach them. The Piper Cub offered exactly what field artillery needed. It was slow enough to circle over targets while observers radioed corrections. It was stable enough to fly in rough weather. It was simple enough that artillery officers could learn to fly it with minimal training. It could take off and land on roads, fields, or any flat surface 300 feet long. Most importantly, it was cheap. A P-51 Mustang cost $50,185 in 1945 dollars. A Piper L-4H Grasshopper cost $2,525. For the price of one fighter, the Army could buy 18 Grasshoppers. The bureaucratic battle. The fight over organic aviation, aircraft under direct control of ground commanders rather than the Air Corps, lasted from 1941 through 1944. General Arnold opposed it vehemently. His argument was institutional. If ground forces controlled their own aircraft, they'd want more aircraft, more pilots, more mechanics, more infrastructure. Eventually, they'd want fighters and bombers. The Air Corps would lose control of military aviation. His argument also had merit. Decentralized aviation meant inefficient use of resources. If each field artillery battalion had its own observation aircraft, you'd need thousands of planes and pilots for a role that centralized reconnaissance could handle with hundreds. But Major General Leslie McNair, commanding Army Ground Forces, countered with operational reality. Centralized reconnaissance created delays that made artillery ineffective. Ground commanders needed immediate response, not Air Corps bureaucracy. Field artillery officers testified that in the 1941 Louisiana maneuvers, divisions with organic light aircraft achieved 300% better artillery accuracy than divisions depending on Air Corps reconnaissance. The units with Piper Cubs could adjust fire within minutes. Units without them wasted hours and ammunition. On June 6, 1942, the War Department approved organic Army aviation. Each field artillery battalion would receive 2 pilots, 2 aircraft, and 1 mechanic. The aircraft would be designated L for liaison. The Piper J-3 Cub became the L-4H Grasshopper. The military modifications were minimal. Piper added a plexiglass greenhouse skylight for better upward visibility. They installed larger rear windows so the observer could see the ground while calling artillery strikes. They painted it olive drab instead of the civilian Cub yellow. Everything else remained civilian spec. Same 65 horsepower Continental engine. Same fabric covering. Same wooden propeller. Same fixed landing gear with bungee cord shock absorbers. William Piper Jr. summarized the conversion process. All we had to do was paint the Cub olive drab to produce a military airplane. The aircraft. Nobody believed the L-4H Grasshopper that Francies flew on April 11, 1945, represented the pinnacle of military Cub development, but its specifications remained modest by any measure. Length, 22 feet, 4.5 inches, wingspan, 35 feet, 2 inches, height, 6 feet, 8 inches, empty weight, 680 pounds, maximum weight, 1,220 pounds, engine, Continental O-173, 65 horsepower, maximum speed, 87 miles per hour, cruise speed, 75 miles per hour, stall speed, 38 miles per hour, service ceiling, 12,000 feet, range 190 miles, endurance 3 hours, fuel capacity 12 gallons, fuel consumption 4 gallons per hour, oil capacity 4 quarts. The control system was entirely mechanical. Cables connected the control stick to the ailerons and elevator. Rudder pedals connected directly to the rudder via cables. There were no hydraulics, no power assist, no complex systems. The cockpit instrumentation was Spartan. Airspeed indicator, altimeter, compass, turn and bank indicator. That was it. No artificial horizon, no radio navigation equipment, no radar, no weapons systems. The aircraft had 2 seats in tandem configuration, pilot in front, observer in back. Both seats had full flight controls, allowing either occupant to fly the aircraft. Communication between pilot and observer was via a speaking tube, literally a flexible tube connecting their positions so they could talk over engine noise. The radio was an SCR 610 FM transceiver. It weighed 25 pounds. It had a range of approximately 15 miles. It provided clear, static-free communication with ground stations. This was crucial. Previous observation aircraft used AM radios prone to interference. Static, atmospheric conditions, and enemy jamming made communications unreliable. The FM radio worked. Observers could clearly transmit coordinates and corrections. Fire direction centers could acknowledge and respond. The system was simple and effective. The aircraft construction reflected its civilian origins. Fuselage, welded steel tube frame covered in fabric, wings, wooden spars, and ribs covered in fabric. All fabric was cotton, treated with dope for weatherproofing and tautness. Propeller, laminated wood, 2 blades, fixed pitch. Landing gear, steel tube with bungee cord shock absorption. There were no luxuries, no heating, no cooling, no weather radar, no de-icing equipment. Pilots flew in summer heat and winter cold with only their flight suits for protection. Above 10,000 feet, they needed oxygen. which wasn't available. So they didn't fly above 10,000 feet. The aircraft had one clever feature, a door on each side of the cabin that could be opened in flight. This provided excellent visibility for the observer. It also allowed pistol fire, as Francis and Martin would demonstrate. The maintenance requirements were minimal. Oil changes every 25 hours. Fabric inspection every 50 hours. Engine overhaul every 400 hours. Mechanics could repair battle damage quickly. Bullet holes in fabric were patched with doped canvas. Bent landing gear was straightened with leverage and heat. Damaged propellers were replaced or repaired. One L-4 in Italy returned from a mission with 47 bullet holes. The pilot was uninjured. Mechanics patched the holes overnight. The aircraft flew the next morning. The simplicity was the genius. No complex systems to fail. No specialized parts difficult to source. No extensive maintenance procedures. A competent mechanic with basic tools could keep a Grasshopper flying indefinitely. This reliability proved crucial in combat conditions, where advanced aircraft often spent more time under maintenance than in the air. The weapon nobody expected between 1942 and 1945. Piper produced 5,673 L-4 variants. They served in every theatre: North Africa, Sicily, Italy, France, Belgium, Germany, the Pacific Islands, Burma, China. The first combat mission occurred on November 9, 1942, during Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of North Africa. 3 L-4s, commanded by Captain Ford Alcombe, took off from the aircraft carrier USS Ranger, cruising off the coast of French Morocco. They launched without catapults. The Grasshopper needed only 300 feet of deck to take off. The mission almost ended in disaster. Allied naval gunners mistook the L-4s for German aircraft and opened fire. Then Vichy French anti-aircraft batteries shot at them. Captain Alcombe landed safely with part of his cockpit shot away, only to be wounded by machine gun fire from French forces. He survived and was treated at an American aid station. Despite the chaotic introduction, the L-4 quickly proved its value. In North Africa, Sicily, and Italy, Grasshoppers directed artillery fire that devastated German positions. German soldiers learned to recognize the sound, a faint buzzing like an oversized mosquito, and immediately seek cover. They knew what followed. The Grasshopper would circle. The observer would radio coordinates. Within 2 minutes, American 105mm or 155mm shells would rain down with terrifying accuracy. One captured German officer, interviewed in 1944, estimated that American artillery accuracy increased 500% when directed by aerial observation. Before Grasshoppers, American artillery hit targets approximately 20% of the time. With Grasshopper spotting, accuracy exceeded 90%. The mathematics of firepower became overwhelming. A single American field artillery battalion had 12 105mm howitzers. Firing at maximum rate, they could deliver 144 shells per minute. One Grasshopper directing one battalion brought more explosive power to bear on a target than an entire B-17 bomb group. A B-17 carried 8,000 pounds of bombs. A field artillery battalion, given 30 minutes, could deliver 60,000 pounds of high explosives to a target area the size of a football field. With precision targeting from a Grasshopper, every shell landed where it needed to. German forces had no effective counter. They couldn't shoot down Grasshoppers with artillery. The planes flew too low and maneuvered too erratically. Fighter aircraft couldn't catch them. By 1944, Allied air superiority meant Luftwaffe fighters rarely operated over front-line positions. When they did appear, Grasshopper pilots simply landed in the nearest field and waited for the threat to pass. Ground fire remained dangerous. German soldiers with rifles, machine guns and burp guns shot at Grasshoppers constantly. L-4 pilots flew missions with bullet holes through wings, fuselage, and sometimes through the propeller. Captain John Johnson of the 9th Infantry Division described being hit by a German machine gun at 200 feet altitude. It started snowing inside my cockpit. Bullets from a burp gun came through the plywood floor. Wood splinters filled the cabin. I kept flying. Another time, an 88 mm anti-aircraft shell exploded next to his aircraft. I thought my observer had hit me over the head. I turned to yell at him and saw a black cloud of smoke beside the plane. When I landed, my mechanic found 2 shrapnel holes through the propeller. We had no spare propellers, so they filled the holes with canvas. I flew with that propeller for the rest of the war. The Pacific nobody remembers. While the L-4 gained fame in Europe, its role in the Pacific theatre was equally important, but different in execution. Pacific operations emphasized evacuation and liaison over artillery spotting. The terrain, dense jungle, mountains, and countless islands, made artillery observation challenging. Naval gunfire and mortars provided most fire support in Pacific amphibious operations, but the Grasshopper found other roles. Medical evacuation became critical in jungle warfare, where ground transportation was nearly impossible. L-4s were modified to carry stretcher patients. A trapdoor in the upper fuselage allowed a stretcher to be loaded. The patient rode externally, strapped to the outside of the aircraft, while the pilot flew to medical facilities. This sounds dangerous. It was. But it was faster than carrying wounded soldiers through miles of jungle. Lieutenant pilots flew countless medevac missions in New Guinea, the Philippines, and throughout the Pacific Islands. They landed on dirt strips hacked from jungle. They took off overloaded, with wounded soldiers strapped to external racks. They navigated by compass through tropical storms. The survival rate for wounded soldiers evacuated by L-4 exceeded 95%. Before aerial evacuation, soldiers with severe wounds often died during ground transport. With L-4 medevac, they reached surgical facilities within an hour of injury. L-4s also guided ground units through terrain where maps were inadequate or non-existent. Pilots would fly reconnaissance, identify paths through jungle or around obstacles, then land and brief ground commanders. In the Philippines, L-4s dropped supplies to isolated units in mountains where ground resupply was impossible. Pilots would fly low and observers would push supply bundles out the door. Not elegant, but effective. Japanese forces recognized the value of American Grasshoppers. They targeted them aggressively. Infiltrators specifically sought out L-4 airstrips to destroy aircraft on the ground. During the Luzon campaign, 12 of the 6th Army's Grasshoppers were lost to direct enemy action. 8 were destroyed by infiltrators who sneaked into American positions at night. On December 6, 1944, 2 Japanese airborne regiments conducted a coordinated attack on Pablo Field No. 2. They overran part of the airfield. 7 of the 11th Airborne Division's 11 L-4s were damaged or destroyed. The remaining 4 were booby-trapped. Within 2 days, the division received replacement aircraft. The Grasshoppers were back in the air. American logistics ensured that destroyed aircraft were replaced almost immediately. The 3-month campaign for Okinawa saw intensive L-4 operations. Japanese defenders used caves and bunkers extensively. Grasshoppers spent entire days spotting cave entrances and fortified positions. One division alone required 14 single-plane flights daily to provide complete coverage of their sector. The advantage in Okinawa was complete air superiority. Japanese air power had been eliminated. L-4s flew without fear of fighter attacks. Ground fire remained dangerous, but without enemy aircraft, survival rates improved dramatically. On Bougainville, L-4 pilots directed naval gunfire as well as artillery. The SCR-610 FM radio could communicate with ships offshore. Observers would spot targets, calculate coordinates, and radio corrections to naval fire direction centers. Destroyers and cruisers firing 5-inch and 6-inch guns could deliver devastating firepower. But without aerial observation, they were firing blind. With L-4 spotters overhead, naval gunfire achieved accuracy comparable to artillery. The Normandy hedgerows, June 7, 1944. D-Day +1, Utah Beach, Normandy. A Stinson L-5 Sentinel, the larger cousin of the L-4, became the first Allied aircraft to land in France after the invasion. The pilot immediately began coordinating with artillery units, establishing fire support for advancing infantry. L-4 Grasshoppers followed within hours. They landed on the beach itself, using hard-packed sand as a runway. Within 24 hours of D-Day, American artillery spotters were operating over Normandy. But the real challenge began in the hedgerows. The bocage country of Normandy was a nightmare for armour. Dense hedgerows, centuries old, created natural fortifications. German forces used them brilliantly for defensive positions. American tanks approaching hedgerows couldn't see what waited on the other side. Often, German Panther or Tiger tanks sat in ambush. American armour would advance, crest the hedgerow, and be destroyed at point-blank range. L-4s changed this equation. Flying at 300 feet, Grasshopper observers could see over hedgerows. They could spot German tanks waiting in ambush. They could radio warnings to American armoured units. Hold position. Enemy armour 200 yards ahead, concealed behind hedgerow. Coordinates follow. This saved countless tanks and lives. American commanders learned to advance with Grasshopper support. If the L-4 reported clear, tanks advanced. If the L-4 reported enemy positions, artillery engaged first, then tanks advanced. The slow cruising speed and low altitude capability that made the L-4 vulnerable in open terrain made it perfect for hedgerow operations. Pilots could loiter over specific areas, providing real-time intelligence. German forces adapted by increasing anti-aircraft fire. The dense vegetation provided cover for German troops with rifles and machine guns. They would wait until L-4s flew overhead, then open fire from concealment. Losses increased, but so did American awareness of enemy positions. The trade was acceptable. Better to lose an occasional observation aircraft than lose multiple tanks to ambush. One L-4 pilot, Lieutenant Darwin Garrard of the 320th Glider Field Artillery Battalion, was attacked by 3 Messerschmitt Me-109 fighters on October 21, 1944. His Grasshopper was hit but not disabled. Ground-based infantry shot down one of the Messerschmitts. The German pilot died in the crash. Garrard landed safely and continued flying missions the same day. The Battle of the Bulge, December 16, 1944. The Ardennes, Belgium. German forces launched their last major offensive in the west. The surprise attack, conducted in terrible weather, initially achieved significant success. American units were overrun or surrounded. The weather grounded most Allied aircraft. Heavy cloud cover, snow and fog made flight operations nearly impossible. The Army Air Force stood down. Fighters couldn't fly. Visibility was near zero. Bombers couldn't navigate. Cloud cover extended from ground level to 20,000 feet. But L-4 Grasshoppers flew anyway. Artillery pilots flew in conditions that would have grounded any other aircraft. Flying at 500 to 600 feet below the cloud ceiling, they provided the only aerial observation available to American commanders. Captain John Johnson stated, "The Air Force stood down during the German advance at the Bulge. But we were out there flying every day at 500 to 600 feet, weather be damned." This wasn't bravery for its own sake. American forces desperately needed intelligence about German movements. Ground observers couldn't see through the weather and terrain. The Grasshopper was the only tool available. Pilots flew in snow, sleet, and fog. They navigated by map and compass, with minimal visibility. They radioed enemy positions and troop movements. They directed artillery fire on German columns, and they got shot at constantly. German forces knew the Grasshoppers were the eyes of American artillery. Destroying them was a priority. Several L-4s were shot down during the Battle of the Bulge. Several more crash-landed due to weather or battle damage. The pilots who survived kept flying. Lieutenant Albert Boulanger of the 82nd Airborne Division flew missions every day from December 17th through December 26th. He spotted German armored columns. He directed artillery fire that destroyed dozens of vehicles. He guided paratroopers through enemy-held territory. On December 23rd, he flew through a snowstorm to deliver ammunition to surrounded American units. The ammunition was loaded in the observer seat. He landed in a field surrounded by German forces. He unloaded the ammunition, took off, and returned to base. By late December, American artillery, guided by Grasshopper observers, was devastating German armored columns. German tanks advancing on roads were easily spotted from the air. American artillery would bracket the columns and destroy vehicles systematically. One German armored battalion, caught in the open by L-4 directed artillery, lost 40 vehicles in 20 minutes. The survivors abandoned their tanks and fled on foot. When the weather finally cleared after Christmas, American fighter bombers joined the battle. But for the critical first 10 days of the German offensive, L-4 Grasshoppers provided the only effective air support available to American ground forces. They flew when nothing else could. They observed when nobody else could see. They killed when no other weapon could reach the enemy. The battle nobody saw. April 11, 1945. American tanks of the 5th Armored Division were racing east across central Germany. The 71st Armored Field Artillery Battalion, equipped with M7 self-propelled 105mm howitzers, advanced with them. Lieutenant Francies and Lieutenant Martin flew ahead of the column, searching for German positions. They spotted a motorcycle with sidecar speeding along a side road. German forces were still active in the area. Then Francies saw something else, a Fieseler Fi-156 Storch observation aircraft flying at about 700 feet above the trees, the German counterpart to the Grasshopper. The Storch was larger than the L-4. It had an inverted V8 Argus engine producing 240 horsepower. It was faster, cruising at 95 miles per hour. It had better range and payload capacity, but it was also unarmed and unarmored. Both aircraft were designed for the same mission, artillery spotting and observation. Neither was meant for combat. Francies made a decision. The Storch had undoubtedly seen the American armor column. If it reported back, German forces would know exactly where the 5th Armored was advancing. Artillery could target the column. Anti-tank guns could set up ambushes. The Storch had to be stopped. Francies radioed his battalion. "We are about to give combat." He had one advantage: altitude. The Grasshopper was flying higher than the Storch. In aerial combat, altitude equals energy. He had one weapon: his service-issue Colt M1911 .45 caliber pistol. So did Lieutenant Martin. That was it. 2 handguns against an aircraft. Francies pushed the nose down and dove toward the Storch. The German pilot saw them coming. He began evasive maneuvers, turning and diving. But he made a mistake. He turned toward the American tanks below, apparently trying to force the Grasshopper into ground fire from advancing armored units. Francies was willing to take that risk. He dove through the German ground fire, closing the distance. At 50 yards, Francies and Martin opened their cockpit doors and began firing their pistols. The wind blast at 85 miles per hour made aiming nearly impossible. The Grasshopper was shaking from the dive. The Storch was manoeuvring violently. But some rounds found their mark. They saw hits on the windscreen, hits on the fuel tank, hits on the right wing. Francies gripped the control column between his knees to free both hands. He ejected the empty magazine, loaded a fresh one, continued firing. Martin did the same. Both men emptied their pistols, reloaded, and emptied them again. The Storch tried to escape by going into a low turn, too low. The right wingtip struck the ground. The aircraft cartwheeled, shedding fabric and metal. It came to rest in a German sugar beet field, partially upright but clearly destroyed. Francies landed the Grasshopper nearby. The German pilot dove behind the pile of sugar beets, hiding. The observer, wounded in the foot by a .45 caliber round, fell to the ground, unable to move. Martin fired a warning shot. The pilot stood up, hands raised. Francies approached the wounded observer and removed his boot. A .45 slug fell out. He bandaged the man's foot using his first aid kit. The German observer thanked him repeatedly, apparently believing they would be executed. Francies took the pilot's Luftwaffe wings, shoulder insignia, and a Nazi battle flag from the Storch as souvenirs. 15 minutes later, American tanks arrived. Francies and Martin turned over the two prisoners and returned to their battalion. They had just scored the last aerial kill of the European war, the only World War II aircraft ever shot down with handguns. A farmer's plane had defeated a German observation aircraft in aerial combat, using nothing but service pistols. The truth they never understood. After the war, captured German officers were interviewed about which Allied weapon systems they feared most. The answers were surprising. Not P-51 Mustangs, not B-17 bombers, not M4 Sherman tanks. The weapon German forces feared most was the L-4 Grasshopper. A captured German artillery commander explained, "The American observation aircraft were the most dangerous enemy we faced. When we saw one overhead, we stopped firing immediately. If we fired, the Americans would locate our battery within 2 minutes. Their artillery response was devastating." Another German officer stated, "The small American spotter planes controlled more firepower than we could imagine. One aircraft could bring down the fire of an entire division. We learned to move only at night." Daytime movement in areas where American observation aircraft operated was suicide. The statistics supported their assessment. In the European theatre, from D-Day to VE Day, L-4 Grasshoppers performed 97% of all artillery adjustment missions. American field artillery, guided by Grasshopper observers, was credited with causing 75% of German casualties in France, Belgium, and Germany. That's not casualties from air power, not casualties from infantry combat, not casualties from tank warfare. 3/4 of German combat losses came from artillery directed by slow, unarmed observation aircraft that the Luftwaffe called the fabric toy. The L-4 wasn't fast, it wasn't armed, it wasn't armored, it couldn't dogfight, it couldn't bomb targets, but it could see. And seeing meant killing. A single Grasshopper orbiting over a battlefield gave American commanders perfect information about enemy positions. That information, transmitted via FM radio to battalion fire direction centers, allowed American artillery to achieve accuracy that German forces couldn't match. German artillery relied on map coordinates, dead reckoning, and occasional visual observation. American artillery had real-time overhead observation with instant radio communication. The technological gap wasn't in the guns. American and German artillery pieces had similar range, accuracy, and explosive power. The gap was in targeting. American artillery knew exactly where to shoot. German artillery was guessing. Innovation under fire. The L-4's success inspired creativity that military doctrine never anticipated. Major Charles Carpenter, flying with the 4th Armoured Division, grew frustrated with the Grasshopper's inability to attack targets directly. He modified his L-4, nicknamed Rosie the Rocketer, by mounting 6 M6A3 bazooka rockets under the wings. This violated every regulation about organic aviation. L-4s were reconnaissance and observation aircraft. They were not ground attack platforms. Carpenter didn't care. He attacked German tanks from the air. On September 20, 1944, during the Battle of Aracourt near Nancy, France, German forces launched a surprise armoured attack. Fog had grounded all Allied aircraft, all except Carpenter's Grasshopper. Around noon, the fog began to lift. Carpenter spotted a company of German Panther tanks advancing toward trapped American units. He dove through German ground fire and began launching bazooka rockets. He flew 3 sorties that afternoon. He fired 16 rockets. He was credited with immobilizing 2 German tanks and several armoured cars while killing or wounding a dozen enemy soldiers. This wasn't doctrine. This was an artillery spotter improvising ground attack tactics in a 65-horsepower observation plane. Other L-4 pilots followed suit. By late 1944, several Grasshoppers carried improvised weapons, smoke rockets for marking targets, bazookas for attacking vehicles, even hand grenades dropped by observers. The Air Corps protested. Ground forces were violating the agreement that limited L-4s to observation roles. If Grasshoppers could attack ground targets, they needed Air Corps pilots and Air Corps control. The War Department reviewed the issue in August 1944. They sided with Army ground forces. Organic aviation would remain under ground force control. Improvised weapons would be tolerated as long as the primary mission, artillery spotting, remained the priority. The Air Corps threatened to revisit the issue if organic aviation expanded further, but by the time Japan surrendered in August 1945, the debate was over. The Grasshopper had won. The final mission, May 8, 1945, Victory in Europe Day. The L-4 Grasshopper had served in every major campaign: North Africa, Sicily, Italy, D-Day, the breakout from Normandy, the liberation of France, the Battle of the Bulge, the Rhine crossing, the final advance into Germany. Over 5,600 Grasshoppers were built. They flew tens of thousands of missions. They directed millions of artillery shells. They guided countless infantry and armour units through enemy territory. The casualties were significant, but proportionally lower than expected. Given that L-4s flew at low altitude over enemy positions without armour or armament, losses could have been catastrophic. Instead, the survival rate exceeded 90%. Pilots learned to fly erratically, making themselves difficult targets. They learned to recognize anti-aircraft fire by the black puffs of smoke. They learned to land in any field within seconds if fighters appeared. They learned that flying low, below 500 feet, made them harder to hit than flying high. German anti-aircraft gunners couldn't track fast-moving targets at very low altitude. By the time gunners acquired the target and fired, the Grasshopper was already past them. The most dangerous enemy wasn't German weapons, it was German frustration. By 1945, German soldiers knew the Grasshopper meant death from above. They shot at them with everything: rifles, machine guns, anti-tank weapons, even pistols. Hundreds of L-4s returned to base with battle damage. Bullet holes through wings, shrapnel tears in the fabric, shattered windscreens, damaged control surfaces. Mechanics patched them with fabric and dope. They filled propeller holes with canvas. They straightened, bent landing gear. They kept the Grasshoppers flying. One L-4 in Italy returned from a mission with 47 bullet holes. The pilot was uninjured. Mechanics counted the holes, patched the fabric, and the aircraft flew the next morning. The legacy nobody expected after World War II, the L-4 continued serving. It flew in Korea, providing artillery spotting for United Nations forces. It flew in Vietnam, where its slow speed and low altitude capability remained valuable for observation and light transport. The last L-4 was retired from military service in 1964. By then, helicopters had taken over the liaison and observation roles, but the Grasshopper had established the foundation for Army aviation. The bureaucratic battles of 1941-1944 over organic aviation created the institutional framework that allowed the Army to operate helicopters after the Air Force separated as an independent service in 1947. Without the L-4, the Army might not have controlled its own aviation. Thousands of L-4s were sold as surplus after the war. Many are still flying today as civilian aircraft. They're prized by collectors and vintage aircraft enthusiasts. Some are restored to military configuration, appearing at air shows and commemorations, and somewhere, on display at the American Heritage Museum in Hudson, Massachusetts, sits one particular L-4H, serial number 43-30426. The Grasshopper flown by Major Charles Carpenter. Rosie the Rocketer, the aircraft that proved a fabric-covered observation plane could become a ground attack aircraft. And in private collections, veterans' families preserve the Grasshopper story. The carrier nobody built. The invasion of Sicily in July 1943 presented a problem. Allied forces needed L-4 Grasshoppers to provide artillery spotting during the amphibious assault, but Sicily was beyond the L-4's 190-mile range from Allied bases in North Africa. The solution was ingenious and completely improvised. Engineers converted landing ship, tank, LST vessels into miniature aircraft carriers. They built wooden flight decks on the flat tank deck. The deck was 216 feet long and 12 feet wide. 4 L-4s could be carried per LST. For launch, they installed the Brody device, a cable suspended between two tall outriggers. A harness attached to the cable could slide down its length. The L-4 would be suspended from the harness. The pilot would climb a rope ladder into the cockpit, apply full power. The aircraft would accelerate down the cable as the harness slid. At flying speed, it would separate from the harness and climb away. For recovery, the system worked in reverse. A hook on the aircraft would catch the cable. The aircraft would be arrested. The harness would slide down the cable, slowing the aircraft to a stop. Then deck crew would haul it back aboard. This was insane by conventional aviation standards. No navy in the world operated aircraft from LSTs. No one had tested the Brody device under combat conditions. It worked perfectly. Dozens of L-4s operated from LST mini-carriers throughout the Mediterranean campaign. They launched for artillery spotting missions. They recovered aboard the LSTs. They refueled, rearmed with fresh batteries for the radio, and launched again. The system proved that when properly motivated, military engineers could make the Grasshopper operate from almost anywhere. Even more remarkably, L-4s launched from the aircraft carrier USS Ranger during Operation Torch in November 1942. 3 Grasshoppers took off from Ranger's flight deck without catapults. They needed only 300 feet of deck space. They flew to shore, established forward observation posts, and began directing naval gunfire against Vichy French positions. This remains the only time in history that Piper Cubs operated from fleet aircraft carriers. Major Carpenter's War. Major Charles Carpenter deserves a deeper examination. His story encapsulates everything the L-4 Grasshopper represented: improvisation, courage, innovation, and effectiveness. Carpenter joined the 4th Armored Division as an artillery spotter. He flew standard observation missions initially: spot enemy positions, radio coordinates, observe artillery fire, adjust as needed. But Carpenter was frustrated. He would spot German tanks, radio their position, wait for artillery response. By the time shells arrived, tanks had often moved, so in late summer 1944 he modified his L-4. He attached two M1 bazookas to the wings. Each bazooka held a single 2.36-inch rocket. The modification violated regulations. He didn't care. He named his aircraft Rosie the Rocketer and began hunting tanks. The tactics were simple: fly low, using terrain for concealment, identify German armor, climb suddenly, fire rockets, dive away. The element of surprise was total. German tank crews never expected attack from a Piper Cub. Fighters, yes. Fighter bombers, certainly. Artillery, always. But a fabric-covered observation plane attacking them with bazookas? Impossible. Except Carpenter did it, repeatedly. As he gained confidence, he increased the armament. 6 M6A3 rockets under the wings. These were high-explosive anti-tank heat warheads capable of penetrating German armor. On September 20, 1944, Carpenter achieved his most significant success. German Panther tanks attacked American positions near Aracourt. Fog grounded all Allied aircraft, except Carpenter. He flew 3 sorties through the fog and ground fire. He fired 16 rockets. He destroyed or immobilized 2 Panthers and several armored cars. He killed or wounded at least a dozen German soldiers. General George Patton heard about the action. He personally visited Carpenter's unit. Patton examined Rosie the Rocketer. He asked Carpenter, "How many tanks have you destroyed?" Carpenter's response was modest. 6 confirmed, sir, possibly more. Patton allegedly replied, "I don't care if it violates every regulation ever written. Keep doing what you're doing." And Carpenter did. He flew over 500 combat missions. He directed artillery fire that destroyed hundreds of vehicles. He personally attacked enemy positions with his improvised weapons. He survived the war without serious injury, despite being shot at constantly. His L-4 accumulated significant battle damage: bullet holes, shrapnel tears, control cable damage. Mechanics repaired it repeatedly. It kept flying. After the war, Carpenter returned to civilian life. He rarely spoke about his combat experiences. Like many veterans, he preferred to leave the war behind. His aircraft, serial number 43-30426, survived. It passed through various owners. It ended up in Austria somehow. In 2017, it was identified in the Austrian Aviation Museum. The Collings Foundation purchased it. Restorers in Oregon returned it to World War II configuration. The restoration was completed on July 4, 2020. Today, Rosie the Rocketer is displayed at the American Heritage Museum. It stands as proof that American combat effectiveness wasn't just about technology or industrial capacity. It was about soldiers improvising solutions to problems their equipment wasn't designed to solve. The truth about artillery. The real story of the L-4 Grasshopper isn't about April 11th, 1945. It's not about Francis and Martin shooting down the Storch with pistols. That's a great story, historically significant and unique. But it's not why the Grasshopper mattered. The Grasshopper mattered because it changed artillery warfare forever. Before the L-4, artillery was an area weapon. You fired at map coordinates. You hoped shells landed near the target. You adjusted fire based on delayed ground observer reports that were imprecise. With the L-4, artillery became a precision weapon. Observers overhead could see exactly where shells landed. They could transmit corrections in real time via FM radio. They could adjust fire until shells were landing exactly on target. This transformed artillery from "maybe we hit something" to we will destroy that specific target. The statistics are devastating. American artillery in World War I achieved approximately 5% accuracy. That means 95 shells out of 100 missed their intended targets. American artillery in World War II, guided by L-4 spotters, achieved 90+% accuracy. That's an 18-fold improvement. This wasn't due to better guns. American artillery pieces in World War II weren't dramatically superior to World War I weapons. The improvement came entirely from better targeting, better observation, real-time communication, immediate adjustment. The Germans understood this by 1944. Captured documents show German officers specifically identifying American aerial artillery observation as the decisive factor in numerous engagements. One German after-action report from August 1944 stated, "American artillery fire, directed by observation aircraft, destroyed our assault formations before we could engage American ground forces. Recommend all future offensive operations be conducted only at night or in weather conditions preventing American aircraft operations." That's a stunning admission. German forces, veterans of Eastern Front operations where they'd faced Soviet artillery for years, feared American artillery more, not because American guns were better, but because American observation was better. And that observation came from a 65-horsepower fabric-covered civilian aircraft that cost less than a jeep. Another captured German commander stated, "The American observation aircraft were the most dangerous enemy weapon we faced. When we saw one overhead, we stopped firing immediately. If we fired, the Americans would locate our battery within 2 minutes. Their artillery response was devastating and accurate." A German artillery officer added, "We learned to move only at night. Daytime movement in areas where American observation aircraft operated was suicide. The small spotter planes controlled more firepower than we could imagine." The mathematics supported their fear. A single American field artillery battalion had 12 105mm howitzers. Firing at maximum rate, they could deliver 144 shells per minute. One Grasshopper directing one battalion brought more explosive tonnage to bear on a target than an entire B-17 bomb group. A B-17 carried 8,000 pounds of bombs. A field artillery battalion, given 30 minutes of sustained fire, could deliver 60,000 pounds of high explosives to a target area. With precision targeting from a Grasshopper, every shell landed where it needed to. From November 1942 through May 1945, L-4 Grasshoppers performed 97% of all artillery adjustment missions in the European theatre. American field artillery, guided by Grasshopper observers, was credited with causing 75% of German casualties in France, Belgium, and Germany. That's not casualties from air power, not casualties from infantry combat, not casualties from tank warfare. 3/4 of German combat losses came from artillery directed by slow, unarmed observation aircraft that the Luftwaffe mocked as the fabric toy. The L-4 wasn't fast. It cruised at 75 miles per hour. It wasn't armed. It carried no guns, no bombs, no rockets, except Carpenter's modifications. It wasn't armored. A rifle bullet could punch through the fabric, but it could see. And seeing meant killing. A single Grasshopper orbiting over a battlefield gave American commanders perfect information about enemy positions. That information, transmitted via FM radio to battalion fire direction centers, allowed American artillery to achieve accuracy that German forces couldn't match. German artillery relied on map coordinates, dead reckoning, and occasional visual observation. American artillery had real-time, overhead observation with instant radio communication. The technological gap wasn't in the guns themselves. American and German artillery pieces had similar range, accuracy, and explosive power. The gap was in targeting. American artillery knew exactly where to shoot, while German artillery was guessing. And in private collections, veterans' families preserve the Grasshopper story. Lieutenant Francies kept his German souvenirs, the Luftwaffe wings, the shoulder insignia, the Nazi flag. He kept the memory of April 11th, 1945, the day he and Lieutenant Martin did the impossible. They shot down a German aircraft with pistols. They proved that victory isn't always about speed, firepower, or technology. Sometimes it's about seeing the battlefield clearly. Sometimes it's about courage and improvisation. Sometimes it's about a pilot and an observer in a slow, unarmed aircraft willing to dive through enemy fire because the mission requires it. The Germans laughed at the Grasshopper. They called it the fabric toy. They called it the American kindergarten plane, until they learned what it could do. By then, it was too late. The farmer's plane had directed the artillery barrage that destroyed German armies across Europe. The crop duster had become the most feared aircraft on the battlefield. Not because it was fast, not because it was armed, not because it was advanced, because it could see, and seeing meant death. Francis and Martin's pistol kill was symbolic of everything the L-4 represented. An aircraft nobody wanted, a mission nobody thought possible, a capability nobody expected, a victory nobody predicted. The Grasshopper wasn't supposed to survive combat. It wasn't supposed to be effective. It wasn't supposed to matter. But it became the weapon that German forces feared most. And on April 11, 1945, it proved that even a farmer's plane could shoot down the enemy, with nothing but 2 Colt .45 pistols and absolute determination.